the arrogant king and his desire for immortality. In the vast kingdom of Zuberi, where golden rivers flowed beneath towering mountains and the soil was rich with life, there ruled a man unlike any other, King Malaki. His name was spoken in hushed whispers, not out of love, but out of fear. Malaki was a man of immeasurable wealth. His palace, built of ivory and stone, was said to touch the sky. His golden throne, studded with rubies, was so heavy that it took 10 men to move. And his warriors, fierce and loyal, were the most feared in the land. But despite all his riches and power, there was one thing Malaki feared more than any enemy, more than any war, more than any god: death. It was whispered among the elders that Malaki would stare at his own reflection for hours, searching for the smallest signs of age. When a gray hair appeared, he plucked it out immediately. When a wrinkle formed, he covered it with gold dust. He did not eat common food, believing that ordinary meals would make him weak. Instead, his servants prepared strange elixirs, filled with the blood of rare beasts and the roots of forbidden plants, all in the hopes that they would grant him eternal life. But no matter what he drank, the fear remained. One day, as he sat on his throne surrounded by his council, Malaki spoke words that would change the fate of the kingdom forever. "I will defy the gods," he declared, his deep voice echoing through the great hall. "If I have 1,000 wives, my name will never die. I will plant my seed across the land, and no spirit, no curse, no blade of time shall take me from this world." His advisors, wise and old, trembled at his words. One, a man named Boko, stepped forward cautiously. "My king," he said, bowing low, "even the greatest of rulers have but one heart. 1,000 wives will not make you live forever, but they will surely bring ruin upon our people." Malaki's eyes darkened. He had no patience for doubt. "Silence," he roared, rising from his throne. "Who are you to question me? I am King Malaki, ruler of Zuberi, master of war, slayer of beasts, commander of the sun." Boko fell silent, his lips pressing into a thin line. The other council members lowered their gazes, afraid to meet the king's burning eyes. And so, the decree was sent. Messengers on horseback rode across the kingdom, demanding that every village, every clan, every family send their daughters to the king's palace. No house was spared. No father could refuse. No mother could protect her child. The people wept. Many daughters tried to run away, but Malaki's warriors were swift. Others hid, but no place was safe from the king's gaze. Some even tried to fight, but what could simple farmers and hunters do against trained warriors? One by one, the women were taken. 100. 200. 500. 1,000. The land of Zuberi, once filled with laughter and love, became a place of sorrow and fear. The night before the grand wedding, the palace was filled with full celebration. Musicians played, dancers twirled, and the finest foods covered the king's table. But outside, the voices of 1,000 women cried out in pain and longing for their families. As the moon rose over the kingdom, a shadow appeared at the palace gates. A woman, old, blind, and draped in tattered robes, stood alone. She was Priestess Nia, the last of the old seers, a woman whose words were said to be touched by the gods themselves. She raised her hand and spoke, her voice like the whispering wind. "King Malaki, you have angered the spirits of the land. You have stolen what was not yours. You believe that 1,000 wives will grant you eternal life, but you are blind to what you have truly invited upon yourself." The king sneered. "And what have I invited, old woman?" Priestess Nia lifted her face, though her empty eyes saw nothing. "The curse of the moonlight," she whispered. A hush fell over the palace. The musicians stopped playing. The dancers froze. Even the warriors, men of battle and blood, shivered at her words. But Malaki laughed. "A curse? From an old woman who cannot even see?" You think I, King Malaki, would fear the words of a beggar? The priestess did not move. Her face remained calm, her lips unwavering. You may laugh tonight, great king. But when the moon reaches its highest point, when its light touches the kingdom of Zuberi, you will know the truth. And by then, it will be too late. With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night like mist before the rising sun. The warrior scoffed, the council muttered, and Malaki, believing himself untouchable, raised his golden goblet. Let the wedding begin, he bellowed, his voice shaking the walls. The people clapped and cheered, but their hearts were heavy. For though Malaki may not have believed the priestess's words, the spirits were listening. And in the depths of the night, beneath the watchful gaze of the gods, something began to stir. Something that would soon bring an end to the greatest king the land had ever known. The tears of the 1,000 brides. The great wedding day arrived, and the kingdom of Zuberi was adorned in gold and silk. The roads leading to the palace were lined with banners, and warriors stood at every corner, ensuring that no one dared to oppose the king's decree. 1,000 women, dressed in the finest garments, were led into the grand courtyard of the ivory palace. Each wore a veil of golden beads, but beneath them, their faces were pale with fear and sorrow. The villagers, forced to attend, stood silently. They did not dare to cheer. They did not dare to weep. They only watched as their daughters, their sisters, their wives were given away to a man who did not love them. King Malaki, dressed in royal red and gold, stood on the highest platform, overlooking his brides. A smug smile played on his lips. Behold, he declared, raising his arms, the greatest wedding in history. 1,000 wives, 1,000 sons, 1,000 years of my reign. The crowd remained silent. Malaki's chief priest stepped forward, a trembling old man who had witnessed too much cruelty. His hands shook as he held up the sacred bowl. The gods must bless this union, he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. Before the sun sets, each bride must drink from the bowl, sealing her fate as the king's wife. One by one, the 1,000 women stepped forward, their eyes hollow, their future stolen. As the first bride lifted the cup to her lips, a sharp wind howled through the courtyard. The sky, which had been bright and cloudless, suddenly darkened. The people gasped. A strange chill settled over the palace. The golden banners fluttered violently. The torches that lined the walls flickered, then died. And then, from somewhere unseen, a voice whispered. A voice soft as the wind, yet loud as thunder. Do you hear them, Malaki? The king froze. His hands clenched into fists. His heart pounded. Who dares to speak, he growled, scanning the crowd. But no one moved. And then, from the far end of the line of brides, a single woman stepped forward. Her veil was different, not of gold, but of silver silk. Her eyes, a shade of deep blue, seemed to glow in the dim light. She was Zola, a woman no one knew, a woman who had not been among the captured brides. She stared up at the king, unafraid. Do you hear them, Malaki? She asked again. The king frowned. Hear what? Zola turned, her eyes sweeping over the 1,000 women standing behind her. The tears, she whispered. The wind howled again, and suddenly, the cries of the brides filled the air. Not soft sobs, not quiet whimpers, but wails. Loud. Heart-wrenching. Endless. The sound rose like a storm, swirling through the palace, battering the walls, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. The people clutched their ears. The warriors stumbled back, their swords rattling in their scabbards. Even Malaki, the mighty king, felt his knees tremble. And then, the moon appeared. A full moon, massive and glowing red, rising over the palace like an eye watching from the heavens. The brides' cries grew louder. Their voices merged into one, a single, sorrowful wail that echoed across the kingdom. Malaki turned to Zola, rage twisting his face. "What trick is this?" he roared. "You bring omens and curses to my wedding." Zola smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "You were warned, great king," she said. "The spirits of the land do not forget. You took what was not given. You broke the sacred balance. And now, the gods demand payment." A flash of lightning split the sky. And then, the women began to change. One by one, the bride's golden veils turned to ashes. Their bodies shimmered, their forms becoming less solid, less human. They were no longer women, but shadows. Specters draped in sorrow, their faces blurred, their eyes empty. The 1,000 brides of King Malaki had become spirits. A curse had fallen upon Zuberi. And it had only just begun. The curse of the moonlight. The ivory palace trembled under the weight of unnatural cries. The 1,000 brides, once flesh and bone, had vanished, leaving behind only their shadowy spirits. They floated above the grand courtyard, their eyes empty, their mouths open in silent wails. The people of Zuberi, who had gathered for the greatest wedding in history, now cowered in terror. The sky burned red with the blood moon, and the air grew thick with the scent of sorrow and revenge. King Malaki, once the most powerful man in the land, could only stare in horror. His golden crown felt heavy on his head, his royal robes like chains around his shoulders. Zola, the mysterious silver-veiled woman, stood before him, her blue eyes glowing in the cursed moonlight. "You have broken the sacred balance," she said, her voice calm yet filled with power. Malaki clenched his fist. "I am the king," he roared, his voice laced with fury. "I will not be threatened by a woman and a storm of ghosts." But the moment he spoke, a cold wind rushed through the palace, howling like a chorus of angry ancestors. The shadows of the brides moved. Slowly, they turned their hollow eyes toward Malaki. And then, as one, they whispered his name. "Malaki." It was a sound so chilling, so unnatural, that even Malaki's warriors, men who had slain beasts, conquered enemies, and fought in countless wars, fell to their knees in fear. The spirits began to descend, their shadowy fingers reaching toward the king. For the first time in his life, King Malaki stepped back. "Kill them," he shouted to his guards. "Strike them down." The warriors hesitated. How can you kill what is already dead? Their hands shook on their weapons, their feet rooted to the floor. One of the braver warriors, a man named Django, finally lunged forward, his spear aimed at one of the spirits. The moment the tip of his blade touched the shadowy figure, his body convulsed. A loud, ear-splitting scream erupted from his throat. His flesh turned pale, his eyes rolled back, and within seconds, his body collapsed into dust. The crowd screamed. The warriors dropped their weapons. There was no fighting what could not be touched. Malaki's breath came in shallow gasps. His mind raced for a solution. "This is a trick," he spat, glaring at Zola. "You are a witch. A demon. I will have your head for this." But Zola did not flinch. She simply turned her glowing blue gaze toward the king and whispered, "You cannot escape fate." And then, the moonlight shifted. The spirits of the brides, their sorrow now turning to anger, rushed forward. Malaki barely had time to react before the shadows wrapped around him. The moment they touched his skin, pain unlike anything he had ever known tore through his body. He screamed, his knees hitting the ground. His flesh burned, not with fire, but with something colder than ice, something that seeped into his bones and filled his soul with suffering. His veins darkened, his eyes blurred, and for the first time in his life, King Malaki felt fear. The spirits whispered in his ear, their voices like shattered glass. "You took our lives. You stole our future. You wished for immortality. Now, you will suffer eternally." The pain intensified, and Malaki's body began to change. His rich, dark skin grew pale, his once magnificent robes rotted, and his fingers became clawed, twisted things. His heart pounded wildly, but no longer did it beat with the rhythm of the living. The spirits had taken his soul and left something else in its place. A curse. A fate worse than death. As the kingdom of Zuberi watched in horrified silence, their mighty king, the man who had believed himself greater than the gods, had become something unnatural. No longer a man. No longer a king. But a wretched creature, trapped between life and death. His scream echoed into the night, a sound that would haunt the land for generations. And as the spirits of the brides faded into the wind, their final whisper lingered in the air. Now, you will know what it means to be forgotten. And with that, the greatest king in history was no more. But the curse of the moonlight had only begun. The kingdom in ruins. The ivory palace lay in silence. Where once the greatest wedding in history had been prepared, nothing remained but ashes and echoes of sorrow. The people of Zuberi, who had gathered to celebrate, now stood frozen in fear. Their mighty king, Malaki, the ruler of 1,000 wives, was no longer a man. He was a creature of the cursed moonlight. His once dark, rich skin had turned pale and ghostly, his eyes hollow and sunken, his fingers gnawed like the roots of a dead tree. His golden robes, once symbols of his greatness, had rotted to tattered rags. But the worst of all, he could no longer speak. When Malaki opened his mouth to command his warriors, no words came. Only a low, hollow sound, like the whisper of a dying wind. The curse had stolen his voice. The warriors, who had once sworn their lives to him, looked at him with horror. The elders, who had once trembled before him, now whispered prayers for his soul. And the common people, the very ones who had feared him most, turned their backs on him. For a king without power is no king at all. The fall of a kingdom. As the blood moon faded, so did the strength of Zuberi. The lands, once fertile and rich, began to dry. The rivers that once ran gold with fish turned black, and the harvest withered to dust. The warriors, who had once marched proudly under Malaki's rule, deserted their post, believing the gods had abandoned them. The nobles, who had once sung Malaki's praises, now fled the palace, taking their treasures and leaving only empty halls behind. And the common folk, the villagers who had suffered under his rule, whispered of the curse of the king who had tried to cheat death, only to become something worse than a ghost. The ivory palace, once the heart of Zuberi, became a place of fear. No one dared enter. No one dared look upon the cursed king, who now wandered its empty halls, lost and silent. But the curse was not finished. The restless king, Malaki, could not sleep. He could not eat. He could not die. He was trapped in a body that no longer belonged to him, forced to wander the palace for eternity. At night, he stared into the great mirrors of his halls, watching as his reflection faded into shadow. He tried to speak to his people, but they ran from him in terror. He tried to command his warriors, but they no longer followed him. He tried to sit upon his throne, but the moment he did, it crumbled beneath him. The ivory palace rejected him. The gods had truly abandoned him. And soon, the people of Zuberi abandoned him too. A kingdom without a king. As the years passed, the once mighty kingdom of Zuberi became nothing more than a ruin. The people left in waves, seeking new lands, new rulers, new lives. The great markets that once bustled with trade became empty streets, overgrown with vines. The golden fields, once filled with harvest, became dry, cracked earth. And the ivory palace, once the crown jewel of the kingdom, became a haunted place. It was said that on nights when the moon was full, if you stood near the palace gates, you could hear the whispers of 1,000 wives. You could hear the cries of a lost king. You could hear the curse of the moonlight still echoing in the halls. The fate of Malaki. No one knows what became of King Malaki. Some say he still roams the ruins, a shadow of his former self, doomed to wander until the end of time. Others say that his spirit was finally taken by the ancestors, and his body crumbled into dust, joining the land he had once ruled. But the people of Zuberi, those who still whisper his name in legend, believe this: that the gods do not forget, and that no man, no matter how powerful, can escape the justice of the spirits. And so, the king who once sought immortality found exactly what he feared most. Not eternal life, but eternal loneliness. And that, the elders say, is a fate worse than death. The journey to redemption. Malaki wandered the ruins of his once great kingdom, his shadow stretching across the broken stones. He was no longer a king, no longer a man, only a cursed soul trapped between life and death. The ivory palace was silent, the once grand halls crumbling around him. The throne he had once ruled from was now nothing but dust. The people who had once feared him had long abandoned him. He had gained everything: power, wealth, 1,000 wives, only to lose it all in the end. And worst of all, he could not die. The whisper of the spirits. One night, as he stared at his pale reflection in a pool of rainwater, a voice whispered in the wind, "You are not beyond redemption." Malaki spun around, his lifeless eyes widening. For the first time in years, he was not alone. A figure stood before him, a woman wrapped in silver veils. Zola. The woman who had spoken the curse of the moonlight upon him. But now, her face was calm. "Why do you haunt me?" Malaki hissed, his voice cracked and hollow. Zola did not flinch. "You wished for immortality, Malaki," she said. "The gods granted your wish. But now you must prove you are worthy to live." Malaki laughed bitterly. "How can I prove anything? My kingdom is gone. My people have fled. I have nothing left." Zola tilted her head, her blue eyes piercing through him. "Then perhaps," she whispered, "you must find what was lost." Before Malaki could speak, a strong gust of wind swept through the ruins. And Zola was gone. The 3 trials. For the first time in centuries, Malaki felt something he had not felt before: hope. If there was a way to break the curse, he would find it. But how? The answer came with the rising sun. As he walked through the broken streets of his deserted kingdom, 3 spirits appeared before him, each one carrying a task. Trial 1, the trial of humility. A young boy stood before him, dressed in rags, his face hollow with hunger. "You who once had everything," the boy said, "must now beg for food, as those you once ignored." Malaki felt his pride twist in his chest. A king does not beg. But he was no longer a king. So he fell to his knees before a village woman, cupping his hands. "Please," he whispered. "I have nothing. I need food." The woman, who had once served in his palace, looked at him with pity, but also with understanding. She gave him a single piece of bread. Malaki bowed his head. The first trial was complete. Trial 2, the trial of sacrifice. A merchant appeared, holding a golden coin. "This is the last of your wealth," he said. "Give it away, and you may pass." Malaki hesitated. With this coin, he could buy back a small piece of his old life. But then he saw a young mother, holding a crying baby, her hands empty. With a deep breath, he placed the coin in her hands. "Take it," he said. The second trial was complete. Trial 3, the trial of truth. The final trial was the hardest. A figure emerged from the shadows, an elder from his court, one of the men he had ignored in his arrogance. "Tell the truth," the elder said. "Confess your sins, not to me, but to the spirits of your wives." Malaki closed his eyes, and for the first time, he spoke the truth out loud. "I was blinded by my own pride. I did not see the pain I caused. I believed I was above the gods. But I was wrong. I took what was not mine, and I paid the price. As he spoke, the sky above him shifted. The curse, which had weighed upon him for so many years, began to crack. The spirits of the 1,000 brides, who had once cursed him, now watched in silence. Then, one by one, they turned away and disappeared. The curse was lifting. The journey to redemption. Malaki collapsed, his body weak but his soul light for the first time in ages. The wind whispered through the ruins. You have learned. You have changed. The gods have seen your heart. And then, Malaki fell into darkness. When he awoke, the sky was bright. The ruins no longer felt empty. He was alive. His body, his curse, gone. But the kingdom of Zuberi was still in ruins. And now, Malaki had one last task. To rebuild what he had destroyed. The spirit's verdict. Malaki awoke to the warmth of the sun on his face. For the first time in centuries, he felt human again. His hands, once pale and clawed, were now strong and warm. His breath, which had once been nothing but hollow air, now filled his lungs with life. The curse was gone. But Zuberi was still in ruins. The mighty kingdom, once a beacon of power, was now a ghost of its former self. The streets were empty, the fields barren, the great ivory palace crumbling under the weight of time. And Malaki knew. Breaking the curse was not enough. If he was truly to be redeemed, he had to restore what had been lost. He had to bring his people home. The return of the people. Malaki walked through the streets of Zuberi, feeling the emptiness press against his chest. Once, these streets were filled with merchants selling spices, with children laughing and playing, with warriors marching proudly. Now, there was only silence. But far beyond the mountains, in the distant villages where the people of Zuberi had fled, whispers began to spread like wildfire. The king has returned. The curse has been lifted. Malaki is no longer the monster we once feared. At first, the people hesitated. Could they really trust the man who had once stolen their daughters and wives? Could a king who had once been so cruel truly have changed? But then, a small group of villagers, the old, the weak, the forgotten, took the first step. They returned to Zuberi, cautious but curious, wondering if the whispers were true. And what they found shocked them. Their king, once dressed in gold and arrogance, was now dressed in simple cloth, working with his hands. He was rebuilding the palace walls with the strength of a common worker. He was digging wells, bringing back fresh water. He was tilling the land, planting seeds where once there had been nothing but dust. He was not commanding them to return. He was not demanding they bow. He was proving his change through his actions. And slowly, the people began to return. The spirit's final test. One night, as Malaki stood at the highest point of the ivory palace, he felt a familiar chill in the air. A wind swept through the ruins, carrying with it the whispers of the 1,000 brides he had wronged. Malaki. He turned, and they were there. The spirits of his 1,000 wives, standing in the moonlight, their eyes no longer filled with anger, but with expectation. Why have you come? Malaki asked, his voice steady. A single spirit stepped forward. Zola. You have lifted the curse, she said, her voice like the rustling of leaves. You have learned humility. You have begun to rebuild. But one test remains. Malaki nodded. Tell me what I must do. Zola lifted a hand, and suddenly, the ruins of Zuberi faded away. Malaki blinked, and in the next moment, he stood in a vast white plain, surrounded by nothing but endless space. Before him stood a golden throne, glowing with divine energy. The throne of Zuberi, Zola said. The seat of power. The final test. Malaki felt a chill run down his spine. He understood. If he sat on that throne, he would reclaim his kingdom. He would be king once more. He would be powerful again. But power was what had ruined him. Power was what had led him to take 1,000 wives. Power was what had cursed him. His hands clenched into fists. Then, with a deep breath, Malaki turned his back on the throne. I do not need power, he said. Zuberi does not need a king who rules through fear. The people must choose their own leader. Silence fell over the white plain. Then, the spirit smiled. Zala bowed her head. Then you have truly changed, Malaki. The golden throne vanished, and the spirits began to fade. You are free, Zala whispered. And so is Zuberi. The spirits disappeared into the wind, and Malaki opened his eyes. To find himself standing once again in the ivory palace, the ruins now glowing in the morning light. The curse was not only broken, Zuberi had been restored. A kingdom reborn. The first light of dawn bathed the ivory palace in gold. For the first time in centuries, Zuberi was alive again. The fields that had once withered to dust were now rich with green harvest. The wells that had run dry now flowed with crystal clear water. The streets that had once been silent and abandoned were now filled with the sound of laughter, of footsteps, of life returning. The curse was truly broken. But the people of Zuberi were still afraid of one thing. Malaki. The man who had once ruled them with an iron fist. The man who had taken their daughters, their sisters, their wives. He had rebuilt their land. But could he truly be trusted? Would he one day return to his old ways? The people gathered in the great courtyard, waiting to hear what Malaki would say. The final decision. Malaki stood on the palace steps, dressed not in robes of gold, but in simple cloth, his hands rough from the labor of rebuilding. He looked out at the faces before him, men and women who had once feared him, children who had once hidden at the sound of his name. And for the first time in his life, Malaki felt no desire for power. He did not want riches. He did not want servants. He did not want 1,000 wives. He only wanted to give back what he had taken. Malaki raised his voice, steady and strong. I was once a foolish king, he said. Blinded by greed. Drunk with arrogance. I thought power was my birthright. I believed I could cheat death. And in my pride, I destroyed my own kingdom. The people remained silent, hanging on his every word. But Zuberi does not belong to me, he continued. It belongs to you. To those who suffered under my rule. To those who fled in fear. To those who return now, uncertain of what comes next. He stepped down from the palace steps, placing himself at eye level with the people. And so I ask you, choose your next ruler. Let Zuberi be led not by a man who took everything for himself, but by one who will serve the people. The crowd stared in shock. Had they heard correctly? The king of 1,000 wives was giving up his throne. For the first time, the people saw something they never thought possible. A king bowing before his people. Malaki knelt in the dust, head lowered, hands open. Let the gods witness, he said. From this day forward, I am no longer your king. The silence broke into whispers. Then, a roar of approval. The people of Zuberi cheered, not for a king, but for a man who had been humbled. For a man who had truly changed. A new beginning. The elders, the warriors, and the villagers gathered to elect a new ruler, one who would guide Zuberi with wisdom and kindness. And as the new leader was crowned, Malaki stood at the edge of the city, looking out toward the horizon. The ivory palace was no longer his home. His name would be remembered, not as the king who married 1,000 wives, but as the man who lost everything and found his soul. Zola, the woman who had once cursed him, now stood beside him. What will you do now? She asked. Malaki smiled, feeling the warm sun on his face. I will go where the wind takes me, he said. Perhaps I will learn what it means to be a man, not a king. Zola nodded. And so, with nothing but the cloth on his back, Malaki stepped forward. And walked into a new destiny. No longer a ruler. No longer a tyrant. Just a man, seeking redemption. And so, the legend of Malaki, the king of 1,000 wives, was told for generations. Not as a warning of power and greed, but as a lesson of humility, redemption, and the power of change. Zuberi had been restored. A kingdom reborn. The first light of dawn bathed the ivory palace in gold. For the first time in centuries, Zuberi was alive again. The fields that had once withered to dust were now rich with green harvest. The wells that had run dry now flowed with crystal clear water. The streets that had once been silent and abandoned were now filled with the sound of laughter, of footsteps, of life returning. The curse was truly broken. But the people of Zuberi were still afraid of one thing. Malaki. The man who had once ruled them with an iron fist. The man who had taken their daughters, their sisters, their wives. He had rebuilt their land. But could he truly be trusted? Would he one day return to his old ways? The people gathered in the great courtyard, waiting to hear what Malaki would say. The final decision. Malaki stood on the palace steps, dressed not in robes of gold, but in simple cloth, his hands rough from the labor of rebuilding. He looked out at the faces before him, men and women who had once feared him, children who had once hidden at the sound of his name. And for the first time in his life, Malaki felt no desire for power. He did not want riches. He did not want servants. He did not want 1,000 wives. He only wanted to give back what he had taken. Malaki raised his voice, steady and strong. I was once a foolish king, he said. Blinded by greed. Drunk with arrogance. I thought power was my birthright. I believed I could cheat death. And in my pride, I destroyed my own kingdom. The people remained silent, hanging on his every word. But Zuberi does not belong to me, he continued. It belongs to you. To those who suffered under my rule. To those who fled in fear. To those who return now, uncertain of what comes next. He stepped down from the palace steps, placing himself at eye level with the people. And so I ask you, choose your next ruler. Let Zuberi be led not by a man who took everything for himself, but by one who will serve the people. The crowd stared in shock. Had they heard correctly? The king of 1,000 wives was giving up his throne. For the first time, the people saw something they never thought possible. A king bowing before his people. Malaki knelt in the dust, head lowered, hands open. Let the gods witness, he said. From this day forward, I am no longer your king. The silence broke into whispers. Then, a roar of approval. The people of Zuberi cheered, not for a king, but for a man who had been humbled. For a man who had truly changed. A new beginning. The elders, the warriors, and the villagers gathered to elect a new ruler, one who would guide Zuberi with wisdom and kindness. And as the new leader was crowned, Malaki stood at the edge of the city, looking out toward the horizon. The ivory palace was no longer his home. His name would be remembered, not as the king who married 1,000 wives, but as the man who lost everything and found his soul. Zola, the woman who had once cursed him, now stood beside him. What will you do now? She asked. Malaki smiled, feeling the warm sun on his face. I will go where the wind takes me, he said. Perhaps I will learn what it means to be a man, not a king. Zola nodded. And so, with nothing but the cloth on his back, Malaki stepped forward. And walked into a new destiny. No longer a ruler. No longer a tyrant. Just a man, seeking redemption. And so, the legend of Malaki, the king of 1,000 wives, was told for generations. not as a warning of power and greed, but as a lesson of humility, redemption, and the power of change.